Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the OECD Environment, Health and Safety Division of the Environment Directorate. I'm Nathalie Delrue, Administrator to the Adverse Outcome Pathway Program at the OECD. Today, you will hear about the recent improvements and future challenges of the Adverse Outcome Pathway Framework and the AOP-Wiki. So we'll have two main presentation sessions followed by a Q&A session. First, the current state of the AOP-Wiki will be presented, as well as the rationale for the recent changes, including those that will be very soon implemented. And this will be followed by a presentation of what we are aiming at in the future and why. At any time during the presentation, you can send your questions via the chat, the Q&A function. Please don't use the chat box. Use the Q&A function in the Zoom control panel. You are welcome. We really welcome your questions and thoughts on the framework and how it could best be adapted to the user needs and to increase the uptake of AOPs in the regulatory environment. So your questions will be addressed either in writing or live during the Q&A session. And if we don't have time enough to address all the questions, we will get back to you by email after the webinar. So to provide a full picture of the AOP framework, we have with us a large panel of speakers representing various organizations and stakeholders, illustrating the international collaboration that is at the core of the OECD AOP development program, at the core of its success so far, 10 years after it started, and at the core of its evolution to always better adapt to the users and to the regulatory needs. I would like to welcome our speakers and panelists. They have been supporting the program since its beginning for most of them, and they have a great knowledge of the AOP framework. So we'll have Clemens Whitwer and Brigitte Landsman from the European Commission Joint Research Center. We'll have Dan Villeneuve from the US Environmental Protection Agency, Jason O'Brien from the Ecotoxicology and Wildlife Health Division at the Environment and Climate Change Canada, Betty Meek from the University of Ottawa, Anna Maria Caruzzi from Interchange Research, Shihori Tanabe from the National Institute of Health Science in Japan. Also on our panel today are Michelle Angrich and Travis Koshnick from the US EPA, as well as Ginny Hench and Steve Edwards at RTI International. Ginny and Steve are bioinformatics scientists and have been and are instrumental in the development of the AOP knowledge base. So I would like to thank all our speakers and panelists very much for their time and their participation in the webinar today. Please note that the webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available in the next few days on the OECD public website. And with this, I will hand over to our first speaker, Dan Villeneuve.
All right, thank you, Natalie. So we're going to start off with providing some background on some recent updates to the AOP-Wiki. We'll talk a little bit about the rationale for why these different features were added, and then show you some screenshots previewing the hands-on technical implementation. So next slide. The first few features that we'll talk about are really resources for AOP developers intended to help them through the process of AOP development. Next slide. So many who have worked on AOPs in the past may be familiar with a document called the User's Handbook. This was really developed and intended as a how-to guide for the development of adverse outcome pathways in the AOP-Wiki. All previous versions of this document, the user's handbook, were reviewed and approved by OECD working parties and published as part of an OECD series on AOPs. You can find that document online. This process of going through developing the guidance and publishing it, getting it cleared by all the working parties while leading to a high quality document was also time consuming. As a result of this process, at times the content would become out of date as the framework evolved and as the changes were made to the AOP-Wiki. And the link to that document was available on the AOP-Wiki, but basically it was just a PDF document. That document really served as the foundation for help text in the AOP-Wiki, but wasn't always current. Next slide. So with the release of AOP-Wiki version 2.5 in July of 2022, the handbook is now available in the AOP-Wiki in a fully electronic and navigable form. It's now easier for AOP developers to access. It provides more seamless integration of the AOP-Wiki with the context-specific help text in the wiki and allows for more rapid updates to the handbook in order to keep things current as the framework evolves. There's also been a name change in the handbook. Previously, we called it the user's handbook, but so as not to confuse the audience in terms of the intent of the handbook, we've renamed it as the AOP Developers Handbook because again, it's really meant as a how-to guide for the development of AOPs. And you'll hear about later some efforts ongoing to provide more of a handbook and some support for people that want to actually use the AOPs that are being developed. Next slide. So if you want to access the electronic AOP Developers Handbook, best way to do that right now is within the AOP-Wiki is to go to the menu ribbon at the top. So you see the black ribbon, there's a menu item called Developers Handbook. If you click on that, it'll take you directly to this electronic version of the handbook. On the left-hand side, you can see a table of contents allowing you to quickly navigate to different sections of the handbook, focused on different parts of AOP development and the different page types in the wiki. And you'll also see two buttons that can either allow you to download a PDF copy of the handbook if you want to have it at your side as you're working, or to see the archived handbooks. Next slide. So this table of archived handbooks lists all previous versions of the developer's handbook. So you might be asking, what if I started my AOP development a year or two ago and it was under a different handbook? The expectation is that AOPs need to be compliant with the handbook version associated with the date that their AOP page was created in the AOP-Wiki or a newer version of the handbook. There are release notes in this table that document the significant changes with each version of the handbook so that it's apparent what changes have been made. And there's also a link to the AOP forum where you can provide feedback on the changes you've seen to the handbook or input on what other changes you might recommend moving forward. In short order, there will also be option for the authors to select the handbook version that they followed during their AOP development, so that's clear to those that would be reviewing and assessing that AOP. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Shihori Tanabe to talk about coaching resources available for AOP developers.
Thank you, Dan. And even with the handbook as a guide, AOP development can be challenging, especially for first-time developers. OECD established a coaching program to pair new with experienced developers. Coaches are available to answer questions and provide guidance. Coaches assure compliance with guidance and handbook during the development process. Coaching avoids discouraging rejection of AOPs after extensive work has been done. Next slide, please. And coaching-related documents are available in threads of the AOP forum on the AOP-Wiki. You can find the AOP forum icon in the community section on the top page of the AOP-Wiki. In the announcements forum on the AOP forum page, the AOP coaches checklist and final review report thread includes the AOP coaching checklist, which was updated on November 29, 2022. And revised version of Guide for Coaches are available in the Guide for Coaches thread. And OECD EGMAST AOP coach status files are available in the coaches thread in Coaching Forum. The latest version of Guide for Coaches is the version of November 24th, 2022. And part 5, AOP follow-up was added to notify that follow-up asking whether AOP development will be continued or not will be conducted annually. And how to know the KE or KR has been reviewed by EGMAST was added as well. Next slide, please. And coach identification will be added to AOP page. And rationale includes increased visibility for the contributions of coaches and incentivization, which means coaching can be cited as professional achievement or contribution, and the ability to search for AOPs by coach. Next slide, please. And coaches' user IDs will be tagged similarly to those of contributors, and this implementation requires coaches have also access to AOP-Wiki, which will be confirmed. So I'll hand over to Betty.
Right, thank you very much, Shihori. So I'm going to address the training resources. So the training resources are rather organized by the EGMAST Education, Communication, and Training subgroup. So in addition to developing communication materials, we've been organizing training materials, putting on courses. We've recently reviewed and cataloged and organized the OECD program training materials. We've updated them, we've streamlined them, and we've added descriptions and time stamping. We also include descriptions of upcoming courses, and there's really two sources of that information. We have a summary on the AOP-Wiki training page that's been added, and that links to posting on the Animal Free Safety Assessment Collaboration website. So next slide, please. Right, so I have a number of animations here which really just point out what's available on the AOP-Wiki training page. So if you can click, so there is a training wiki. There's also, if you can click it, you can request training. So if you fill out a form, the Education, Training, Communication subgroup can put together courses. And the next click, please. It also links to the OECD AOP webinars, which are general descriptions or introductory descriptions on adverse outcome pathway. Next click, please. And upcoming events, so courses that we have scheduled associated with, for example, scientific association meetings, etc. And then one more click. And it also links to the catalog of training materials and resources that we have included at the Animal Free Safety Assessment Collaboration website. Next slide, please. And in fact, I just wanted to point out how we've organized those materials. So we've actually categorized them by introductory materials, advanced materials, but also materials for AOP reviewers and editors. Next click, please. So in fact, that's how we've categorized them. If you click again, please. And there's a description, as I'd indicated. Next click. The year that the materials were produced, how current they are, the type, and finally some time stamping. So I will hand it over now to the next presenter to deal with the third-party tools.
Thank you, Betty. That's me, Clemens Wittwer. Thank you. So we will run you now through a series of slides that show you some added functionality in the wiki. Click, please. So the AOP-Wiki team cannot possibly cover all functionalities that the stakeholder community might request and rightly request. So you see us exhausted in front of all the requirements. Click, please. So a series of pilot collaborations with outside software providers was initiated. So we struck up a deal with a series of a number of parties that were interested in becoming part of this enterprise. Click, please. So we have come up with third-party connections to ways of visualizing AOPs in an innovative way. So novel ways of graphical AOP depictions are now available via third-party tools. And we also have a tool that helps in identifying literature that strengthens the evidence behind AOP elements. So these two things are already in place. Next slide, please. And based on these pilot experiences, more possibilities for third-party collaborations will obviously arise. And everyone is more than welcome to contact us and come up with clever new ideas on how you can interface your products with the wiki. Next slide, please. So this is what you see when you go to the wiki. For example, just to show, so these are the tools that we are linking to, the 5 tools here. And the right-hand side of the screen shows an example. So when you go on an AOP page and you look at the graphical representation of an AOP, you will recognize this little button, Explore AOP in a third-party tool. And what happens when you click on that, the third-party tool from LASA called Captis will open and will display your AOP in an alternative way. So this is a way in which we try to also pick up ideas from parties that are not in the inner circle of the AOP-Wiki team, but also be always open for third-party ideas. Thank you very much. Next one is Dan, who will talk about stressors.
All right, so you've heard a bit about some of the resources that have been made available for AOP developers in the AOP-Wiki. So the next set of features that we're going to be talking about are really focused on changes to the framework itself and some of the modifications to the framework and associated changes to the AOP-Wiki. And one of those has to do with stressors in the AOP-Wiki. So those of you who are familiar with the principles of AOP development know well that AOPs are not stressor specific. So we don't develop AOPs for specific chemicals or specific types of stressors necessarily, but rather they're general descriptions of biological response to different kinds of biological perturbation. And it was always intended that the AOP-Wiki would be searched by particular biological activities or biological effects. However, we recognize that risk assessments and chemical safety decision-making are often done on a chemical specific basis. And so users have consistently requested and wanted the ability to search the AOP-Wiki by stressor. Next slide. So in previous versions of the AOP-Wiki prior to release 2.5, you would have seen along the menu ribbon at the top a link to stressors, or you'd see that on the home page a button that could take you to a list of stressors in the AOP-Wiki. We allowed for annotation of key events with a list of stressors that were known or thought to activate that key event. That stressor list could be searched within the AOP-Wiki, but there were some problems associated with this approach. First, that list of stressors was by no means comprehensive, so people would go to search for their favorite chemical, not necessarily find it there. Trying to provide some comprehensive and exhaustive list of every chemical that could activate a key event, certainly not something that's possible. Those stressor identifications or annotations that were in the wiki, the way things were structured, there was no supporting evidence required for that. And so this rightly led to questions about what is the credibility that this particular stressor will activate this key event, and the process of trying to identify what evidence that a developer needs to provide in order to make that connection credible really turns into a de facto hazard assessment. And under different regulatory settings and so on, hazard assessments are done in different ways. They require different levels of evidence, different types of evidence. And it's really not the role of the AOP developer to actually do a hazard assessment. And so with this in mind, next slide. After considerable debate and discussion within the extended advisory group on molecular screening and toxicogenomics, discussion within a working group on stressors. It was ultimately decided to remove stressors from the AOP-Wiki and instead focus on the concept of prototypical stressors. Here, a prototypical stressor is defined as a stressor that is known to trigger the molecular initiating event of an AOP and for which there is an extensive database with respect to its impacts on downstream key events, such that it provides considerable support for the key event relationships across the AOP as a whole. So this isn't just an annotation to a single key event, but rather this is a stressor that's characteristic and produces the entire suite of responses that's documented in the AOP. So the prototypical stressors often serve as a focal point for literature searches and other assembly of empirical support for the AOP, and noting here that these aren't necessarily just chemicals. Prototypical stressors can be other stressors like radiation, environmental factors, disease, etc. Next slide. Prototypical stressors and the identification of prototypical stressors is still considered important in the AOP-Wiki, but instead of linking these to individual key events, prototypical stressors are now linked only to a full AOP on the AOP pages. This is important. These can serve as sort of a positive control for a given pathway. So if you're doing an experiment, want to know if a chemical of interest that you're working on acts through this particular AOP, experimentally, you can use that prototypical stressor as a positive control to make sure your assay system is working well. You can also use prototypical stressors to serve as a reference point for quantitative understanding to better understand or document how much perturbation with your stressor or chemical of interest is needed to drive this pathway all the way to the adverse outcome. And using the prototypical stressors in that way can provide a lot better quantitative understanding, but it's important to recognize that this is also based on a series of assumptions. And so it's important to test and evaluate that series of assumptions if you want to use the prototypical stressors as a reference or in estimating relative potency to produce the effects along the pathway. Next slide. So the implementation of this in the AOP-Wiki, on each AOP page, you have the option to annotate those with a prototypical stressor. The listing of all the prototypical stressors that get annotated into the AOP-Wiki will be available through these menu items, prototypical stressors that will bring up a list. Next slide. And when you bring up that list, essentially what you'll see is those listing of the prototypical stressors, what that stressor is, and all the associated AOPs for which that compound serves, or compound or other type of stressor serves as the prototypical stressor. Next slide. So I'll turn it back over to Betty.
Right. So I'm going to address the AOP development strategy, and that really relates to kind of transparently and systematically identifying the evidence base for adverse outcome pathway development, which is really important for confidence for regulatory application. It's really important to understand as well that there's really no right way to identify data relevant to adverse outcome pathway development. That will vary depending upon the scope of your development of the adverse outcome pathway, the nature of the prior documentation. It could be the starting point for development. Are you starting with a molecular initiating event? Are you starting from an adverse outcome? The complexity of the envisaged pathway or the envisaged application. It also needs to take into account that adverse outcome pathway development is an expert-driven process. In fact, these adverse outcome pathways are largely developed by expert teams who assimilate and evaluate the data. And then they go through a peer review process through the OECD review and approval. And also, we have weight of evidence considerations for the integrative aspects of adverse outcome pathways that are really important in terms of flagging the most influential data to support application. But all of those considerations aside, there is really a need to describe the approach to support regulatory application. Again, it's really about confidence in that the available data have been identified without bias and transparently documenting how you've gone about that. Next slide, please. So added to the July 2022 version of the handbook wiki is an intentionally non-prescriptive kind of text description of in fact, the AOP development strategy. So on the AOP page, we indicate the context of why the AOP was developed. And in the handbook, in the developer's handbook, we describe some of the considerations that need to be made in terms of describing that context. What was the research question or problem formulation? What's the scope? What's the envisaged use? And the funding source and stakeholders. And the strategy, how the AOP was developed, the decisions on the level of resolution at which to describe the pathway, and the overall data search and identification strategies. For example, did you document the pathway based on prototypical stressors? And then on the KER pages, a more detailed description of the evidence collection strategy, such as the use of systematic review tools. Next slide, please. So again, this is deliberately non-prescriptive. This is in the wiki. It is this free textbook box description on the AOP development strategy, outlining the context and the strategy. Next slide, please. And I'll pass it on to Brigitte to address modulating factors.
Thanks, Betty, and hello, everyone. Modulating factors, they are very important for a better understanding of the pathway and the prediction of the outcome. So how are they defined? They are not part of the actual pathway, but they may alter the shape of the response function. And they have an impact, might have an impact on the progression of the pathway and the severity of the outcome. The evidence then is written in the special key event relationships. As they have a place there, the modulating factors, they haven't been really considered. And when the pandemic came up, we saw that the COVID outcomes were so different. And this CHOW project aimed at mechanistically understanding why these adversities were so differently. So this case study was a bit too fast. This case study was was done to explore this, and it was actually about discussing this complexity and to raising awareness. And it was mainly discussions with an interdisciplinary group and also with various OECD subgroups. And among other things, we found out, and what has never been more to be specified, the role of time, for instance, when these factors are acting, that chemicals or agents, they might be maybe stressors and even also modulating factors, that the key event in one AOP might be a modulating factor in another one, and that modulated factors may target several key event relationships and also interact between several modulating factors exist. Next slide, please. Next, and so what has been new and been added? This improved visibility hopefully will also stimulate more consideration of these modulating factors. Slide, yeah. So what we have now is a table on the overview page, which indicates the modulating factors. And there it's important that we only use those modulating factors that have a solid evidence for having an impact. Then we describe the influence and describe the KRs that involved. Next one. While on the KR pages, next one, please. Another one. Well, on the KR pages, we have the modulating factors, name them. Next slide, please, and next click. And also these features that describe them. And here we should specify the age, for instance, so which age range. And then the effects, preferably in a quantitative form, so how much effect, how much increase or decrease, and then the list of references. Next slide, please. And how does this look in real time? So this is a screenshot from the CHOW project, where we see this list as described before. What's missing here is the weight of evidence evaluation, which definitely needs to be added. So we have a list of modulating factors, how they influence. These all increase the risk, but not given unfortunately not yet how much, and the key event relationship. And next one. Then we have on the KR page, also here, the weight of evidence is missing and we added it to the names. Then with the specification, also here needs more clarification. So female sex, is this sufficient or do we need to give the hormone, or is this too explicit? And also the description there, it's long description. So bullet points would be better here and still had to be done, yeah? So that's about our first experiences, as I said, learning by doing. And next click, and we would be happy if you could click, please, if you could share with us your experience, if you have one, and your opinion. Thanks, and over to Dan.
All right, Brigitte. So we just talked about some changes or updates to the framework itself. There are a number of additional features in recent releases and planned releases of the AOP-Wiki that are aimed at improving the user experience. Next slide. One of those first improvements that you'll see is improved searching, filtering, and findability within the AOP-Wiki. So as the additional content has been added to the AOP-Wiki over the years, there's growing numbers of AOPs and associated key event and key event relationship pages found in the AOP-Wiki. While this is great from a user perspective in that there's more content there, it also makes it increasingly difficult to hone in on the AOPs of greatest interest based on the previously existing help search features, which were focused on searching for specific text in the title of the different pages or in the text of the pages. So that was kind of how the search functions operated. So we wanted the ability to search, sort, and filter the list of AOPs based on multiple different criteria, including not only the title, but also identification of specific molecular initiating events or adverse outcomes, maybe who the point of contact was developing the AOP, filtering by OECD status. So for example, the ability to just quickly hone in on those AOPs that have been endorsed by OECD or have gone through technical peer review. Next slide. So in implementing these features, when you look at the AOP listing in the AOP-Wiki as it exists now since release 2.5 in July of 2022, you'll see this set of filters in the column headers for the AOP listing in the table. And each of these column headers provides a search and filter box that you can enter information into. So there's some of these that allow for free text entries where you can type in keywords, different gene symbols, other types of annotations directly into that search box at the top of the column. It will then filter based on that search term you entered. Next slide. Some of the columns that use restricted vocabularies have drop-down menus so that you can select from different drop-down options associated with that column. So this, in the case of the OECD status column, you can select based on the different status that you're interested in and see the listing of AOPs filtered based on that selection criteria. Next slide. You can also use various comparison operators. So if you're looking for more recent AOPs, for example, you could say, I want to see all AOP ID numbers greater than 450 as a way to see the more recent content. You can use greater than, equal than, various wildcards, and you can apply these various search terms and filters across multiple columns to refine those searches even further. So this really provides a lot more flexibility and specificity when trying to find different AOPs for different types of questions or decision contexts you have. Next slide. We've also made some changes to protect content under development in the AOP-Wiki. So the AOP framework and the AOP-Wiki themselves were developed based on a crowdsourcing and open access ethos. So we really wanted the ability for multiple authors to contribute to pages, and we wanted the ability for anyone to access the information worldwide. The whole intent of the AOP framework is to get this information out to users that need it, to decision makers that need to understand these linkages in order to help with various kinds of hazard related decisions. So with this in mind, the previous licensing in the AOP-Wiki, there are two types of licenses. The AOP pages were under a Creative Commons license that were completely open other than requiring attribution. The key event and key event relationship pages, because these were shared pages within the AOP-Wiki, were under a no rights reserved license. There was basically no restrictions at all on use. Next slide. This proved a little bit problematic for AOP developers. One of the problems stemmed from the fact that we had a series of author status fields where authors were able to indicate the status of their AOP, whether it was still under development, and they would indicate whether that content should be cited, whether it's open for commenting, and so on. This was sort of rules of the road or the general courtesies, if you will, of using the AOP-Wiki, but there's really no legal backing for the restrictions on use. And so the content, even content that was incomplete or still under development by the authors, was basically freely accessible for anyone else to take and do other things with. So this made developers somewhat hesitant to post content that was still under development and led to a lot of users developing their content offline, potentially resulting in redundant AOP development, repetition of work that maybe didn't need to be done. And then developers were also concerned about the effort and the work and the intellectual property that they've put into the process of AOP development. And anyone who's done this knows it's a considerable amount of time and effort, but concerns about their work and effort being taken and used elsewhere, including for publication or commercial use without attribution, and particularly in the case of the key event and key event relationship pages, which again were a completely open access sort of license. Next slide. So to address these concerns, we are planning some changes to the AOP-Wiki licensing with the release of version 2.6 planned for February. So the AOP pages, on the AOP pages, the default license will change from Creative Commons attribution license to Creative Commons attribution and share alike. That means no one can restrict access to the work. You have to give proper attribution to the authors and retain the current license notice. And any release of derivative works must be done under an identical or similar license. Importantly, authors will also now have the option to override the default AOP license and select an all rights reserved license during the process of AOP development. This will effectively allow the AOP pages in the wiki to function just like a preprint server. That all rights reserved has to be renewed yearly by the author, but as long as they're actively developing the page and continue to renew that all rights reserved, they can fully protect the content of the AOP pages. Next slide. In terms of the key event and key event relationship pages, it's a little bit more difficult to implement an all rights reserved license on these pages because any AOP-Wiki user with author access is able to edit these, and we want to retain that to allow for crowdsourced development. So in terms of the licensing changes, the default license on the key event and key event relationship pages will be changing from a completely open access license to a Creative Commons attribution share alike license. That way, at least if that content is used, whoever's using that content has to attribute the original developer of that content. In the short term, if developers want to protect their content, protect their intellectual property, we'll encourage them to use external preprint servers to protect that content and then just cite that in the AOP-Wiki. But longer term, we're trying to establish contributor tagging and text block level licensing so that users could protect and reserve all the rights to the content they're adding, even to those shared pages. Next slide. So in terms of the implication, when you create an AOP page under the next version, you'll basically get this drop-down menu allowing you to select either the all rights reserved license, the default share alike license, or to indicate that your AOP is open for adoption. You'll get a warning that this is the only opportunity to select an all rights reserved license. Next slide. AOPs with an all rights reserved license, when you edit that page, you'll get a notification telling you that your current all rights reserved license will expire on a certain date, and you'll have a button there with the option to extend that all rights reserved period longer. But if you don't extend that, by default, once that year is up, it will default over to the share alike license. Next slide. And importantly, once it has gone to a share alike license, there isn't any going back. Once that content is released, an all rights reserved license can no longer be applied. Next slide. The logo for the appropriate licensing associated with each page will be available at the top of the page, along with a description of what the restrictions are associated with that license. Next slide. And so I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker to talk about looking forward beyond February and the release of AOP-Wiki 2.6, some of the challenges that we've addressed with the framework, and some of the ways that we're thinking about addressing these with future potential changes to the wiki and the framework.
Right, thanks, Dan. So, so we have an initiative for the AOP development program, which is really looking about whether we can tap into the use of systematic review methods for documenting the evidence base for adverse outcome pathways. And so that is still a work in progress. And so what we're suggesting currently, based on the input we've received to date and the experience that developers have acquired using systematic review tools in AOP development, is that as a potential workflow is that you start with the expert-informed hypothesized adverse outcome pathway that's normally hypothesized by the development team, and then do evidence mapping based on the hypothesized key events and key event relationships. And that evidence mapping, you really are looking to design or streamline to identify the most influential data sets. And of course, those are identified by the weight of evidence considerations, where we're looking at the kinds of patterns we expect across the adverse outcome pathway to determine whether the available data actually supports the hypothesized adverse outcome pathway. And then to do expert-informed additional targeted searching in gap areas, and depending upon the extent of the data identified, i.e. the magnitude of the task, to consider the potential value of using one of the systematic review screening tools. And I think the part that we haven't really addressed yet is really the relevant critical study quality considerations in an adverse outcome pathway context to be more formalized by the AOP development community. So the AOP development teams, certainly these are their areas of expertise, and they consider the quality of the studies in AOP development, but we'd like to formalize that to a greater extent. Because many of those currently considered for studies in individual lines of evidence in systematic review methods for example, stressor-specific assessment, are not so relevant to adverse outcome pathway development. And again, the weight of evidence considerations, these patterns that we're looking across key event relationships, are really influential in identifying the types of experimental data that we'd like to have. So once additionally developed and agreed, then we could think about designing the relevant data entry forms to address those quality considerations. And we've also been thinking about, this is the actual existing table of contents for the handbook. And so you can see here that we have section 1 is the AOP description, section 2, the key event descriptions, section 3, the key event relationship descriptions, and we don't really get to overall assessment of the adverse outcome pathway. So we proposed refining that in future editions of the handbook to focus more on the unit of application, which is actually the adverse outcome pathway. So if you can click, please. So the objective is really to better frame the context for developers up front, and that's really application and the kinds of influential study design that support application. Next click, please. We also need to address some inconsistencies that occur between the key event relationship descriptions and the overall description of the adverse outcome pathway and the supporting weight of evidence. And we would really see deleting section 4 and subsuming that in section 1, which is the adverse outcome pathway. So essentially then you would have, and we would actually delete the more detailed annexes. They would be subsumed in other sections of the report, and the AOP description would essentially provide all of the critically important information to facilitate application. So if you go to the next slide then, so again, and click once. So we see the AOP graphical representation as being very important. And we would describe the development strategy, the support and assessment, essentially to support application. And then if you could click again, please. So that's section 1, click again. That would then map to the key event descriptions and finally to the key event relationship descriptions. So again, the focus of the development is really the pathway. That's the unit of application. And if that would simplify use of the information for the regulatory community. And if they need more information, and depending upon your application, you may, then you would in fact go into the underlying key event and key event relationship descriptions, which are more detailed. So we also, in fact, have proposed the development of a wiki navigation guide. So, so this is really developing a navigation guide to the AOP-Wiki for application, including chemical-specific application. And in fact, this idea came about really based on the suggestion of the regulatory community. And we've been thinking about, well, how could we tailor that to best meet their needs? So essentially to map to the basic content of what adverse outcome pathways are, how confidence is assessed, the systematic consideration of data sources and integration. But it's really the focus is how to navigate, apply the information, including a link to other relevant tools. Again, the focus is on adverse outcome pathways, the unit of application, taking into account the needs of the users. And of course, adverse outcome pathways are used by a number of different programs for different applications. And the ones that we see most are the chemical specific assessment programs who are organizing data based on described pathways. And that's often if they're assessing data rich chemicals. We have the vastly expanded chemical specific mandates where you're often dealing with data poor chemicals. So you're looking to use the mechanistic information more for grouping and read across or predictive inference. And finally, the integrated approaches to testing and assessment. And so our objective moving forward here is really to involve a working and focus group of engaged regulators. So it's really to bridge this gap between the kind of development and application community. Next slide, please. So adverse outcome pathways and moving forward again and needing this engagement of the regulatory community. So mode of action was originally defined in the context of regulatory application, as are adverse outcome pathways. So they're defined in the context of their being developed at the level of kind of resolution that informs regulatory application. There's been much experience in chemical-specific mode of action application, and there's evolving experience in adverse outcome pathway application, particularly in the area of integrated approaches to testing and assessment. So we'd really like to have greater focus to support regulatory, the predictive aspects, better documentation, more systematic, transparent, and consistent consideration of evidence and assessment. And I think that what we've seen to date is that these regulatory research partnerships work best. And for example, the European Food Safety Agency has been developing adverse outcome pathways for needs that they've identified within the agency. And they do that through a collaborative process with engaged researchers. So moving forward, what we're thinking maybe missing currently is a common understanding for application and perhaps more input partnership with regulatory and really accessing your ideas. So if you click again, it really is a question of kind of engaging that input in making the output of the wiki more usable to the regulatory community. And with that, I will pass it on to Clemens again to talk about test methods.
Thank you, Betty. Well, we are already deep into the portion of the presentation where we talk about challenges ahead. And one of the things that we identified that need a closer look at is the treatment of test methods in the AOP-Wiki. Click, please. So the current situation, as you all know, is this. You have, click. You have a current situation in which you have some method information within the key event page and the molecular initiating event page. So this information about the test method is very free texty and not really formalized. Click, please. It's very ad hoc and not systematic. Click. And how can we connect chemicals to AOPs? That's the holy grail of the whole AOP framework. How can we do that? And we think that the method information is maybe the key there. Click, please. And so there is also a recent report that we published addressing evidence needs in chemical policy and regulation. And click. One of the things that we identify there is that the information about methods with which we underpin key event information needs to be stressed much more explicitly than we do right now. Click, please. So how can we be more transparent about the methods used in the creation of an AOP, and how can we thereby increase the trust that regulators, especially regulators, have in an AOP? And we think that stressing the method information in the way that we see right now in the desired situation will help us. Click, please. So what we want to do is pull out the method information out of the key event and molecular initiating event box and create a separate entity in which we describe method information in much more formalized and standardized way. And you see in this picture that, for example, method C, as you see here, can both be used in key event, in the first key event and the second key event. If you do that in the current situation, you will run in all kinds of problems because you would have to repeat the description of the methods both in the first and the second key event. So if we pull out the method information and make it a distinct object, as we call it in the data model, then we can solve this problem. Yes, click, please. And if we then link data from some data collection to the method, then we implicitly and intrinsically also link the substance data to the AOP. So if we have a substance information database which says, okay, I derived my substance information with a certain method, then I can link this substance information to, for example, here, method D, and by having linked key event, the second key event also to method D, you have an implicit connection between a real life chemical, not the prototypical stress, but the real life chemical to an AOP. And the same, click please, and the same thing can happen then also with as many data collections as you want. So this connection between real life chemicals and AOPs, we think the golden bridge for that is a more explicit description of the methods. And final slide of this part, we have already started an initiative that we call the Methods to AOP initiative. Click, please, which is a spontaneous initiative of people who came up with this idea that this is important, and we just focus on this now in a loose collaboration. Click, please. And our objective is to deliver a series of actionable test method related recommendations to the OECD, but also a collection of implementable ICT requirements to the KB, to the people who develop the KP. So these are the two things that we want to deliver. And last click. The role of this initiative was already acknowledged by sorry for this acronym, by OECD. So the OECD is already awaiting our recommendations concerning methods, and we are looking forward to delivering that in the first quarter of 23. Thank you very much, and I hand over to Anna Maria, who will talk about visualizations.
Hello, everybody, and I'm going to be talking about an initiative on the AOP visualization. frequently in encounters with user groups and others, when we spoke about AOP, the question of the AOP diagram came up, and often there were discussions of what were perceived as its limitations. So we decided to do some more user-centered design with particular user groups. And this is an attempt to engage users more closely with the AOP diagrams of the AOP-Wiki as it is developed. So it's a co-creation exercise involving user groups, and hoping that those user groups then feel more engaged with the AOP-Wiki as it goes on, and continue to give us their inputs. So far we've had 2 focus groups, one in Brussels, and that one involved mainly AOP developers. There were also some regulators there, but these were people who were very familiar already with the AOP framework and its use. And we had another focus group in Ottawa, and that was mainly potential AOP users. They were mostly in regulatory contexts, and they mostly had were less familiar with the AOPs. And the method used in these focus groups was to get people to diagram together. That is, to create diagrams together so that we could understand what are their intuitions about diagrams in general, and how did they want the AOP examples in particular to reflect their intuitions about diagramming. So these are just a few examples that we had. There were some very, very striking examples of these diagrams produced. We used everyday examples like traffic, bread, shampoos, you know, those kinds of things, and then the more specialized AOP examples. And click, please. And these are just the examples of where we've, and some more examples of these diagrams, and what we then pulled our kind of requirements list out of the discussion around these diagrams. And you can see just how many different styles there were in creating these diagrams. Next slide, please. So this is the top level list. I mean, there's a lot of detail, and I've just pulled out some of the points from them. And I think many of these points actually are addressed in other places, other discussions that you've already heard, and other places on the wiki. But this was what people felt that they wanted to see in the diagram itself. So in particular, that there was a need for a standardized spatial organization. For example, that the biological levels should always be dealt with in the same way. There was a lot of sorry, excuse me. Excuse me. People felt that they wanted to see different levels of detail depending on their purposes, and they wanted to be able to search or filter according to different purposes, and this would be supported by the ontology of the AOP-Wiki. They also in general wanted greater interactivity. So for example, the possibility of clicking on the boxes for more information about key events, and clicking on the links for more evidence behind the key event relationships. So on the whole, there was a feeling that the key event relationship is not shown with the significance and importance that it actually has, that people pay much more attention to key events in the boxes, but that the key event relationship is what's really key, and what they wanted to be able to see the evidence for, and they wanted to be able to see the evidence for the key event relationships more directly from the diagram. And for example, by clicking on it to see, so what was the evidence for it? And the evidence that they wanted to be able to pull up from that arrow by clicking onto the arrow was like a table, for example, not just simply references to the sources. And very much there was a desire to see the ability to have the ability to control how much of the AOP is seen. So it might even be collapsing it so that only the MIE and the adverse outcome are seen. In some cases, the regulators said maybe that's all we need, and to be able to control just how much of the detail is seen. There was a desire for more readability from the diagram itself. So, for example, one of the ideas was to be able to see the level of organization directly from the key event box. Also to see how many other AOPs are connected to a key event, so that regulators, for example, would know whether they needed to pay attention to it or not, or what kind of analogy, what kind of evidence is there for the key event or the key event relationship. And an analogy was given at the Ottawa focus group of the periodic table. Can we click here? Right, so you'll see it. This is taken directly from the diagram. There's a box there, and it's got all little symbols in it, and those symbols would indicate what kinds of evidence is there from what kind of methods. So, for example, was there in silico or in vitro, or what kind of evidence was there for it? The little symbol would be there if there was that kind of evidence, and would not be there if there was not that kind of evidence, and a little symbol also where you could click for references available for that component of the diagram. So it was kind of, don't reinvent the wheel. We've already got the periodic table and it works really well. You might also be able to get from the boxes issue the information about how many other AOPs are connected to a key event. And then running up along the side of symbols that could be used also possibly within the box for what is the level of organization, where does it belong, what is the topology of that key event. And knowing the topology of the key event was also something that was expressed as a desirable element by developers. Okay, click please. Also, they wanted a more direct way of showing what is the weight of evidence through, for example, the weight of the arrows. And that there also should be some kind of distinction between different kinds of evidence. So evidence for what kind, for organisms, or what type of evidence was it? So again, linking back with what Clemens was talking about, being able to link directly and being able to have information directly about methods behind the evidence that was being given, so that you know what form of evidence you're dealing with, was something that people really wanted to see directly from the diagram. Also, better ways of showing up what is not known, what is, or showing up uncertainty, as well as levels of probability. That was something that was spoken about a lot by both of the groups, with kind of acknowledgement that as scientists, there's also a kind of a bias in diagrams to show what you know, rather the diagrams are there to show what is known, rather than what is not known, but a felt need for showing up what is not known and what are the levels of uncertainty. A lot of complaints that we often hear about the diagram is that it's too linear, but there's a general understanding that feedback loops, meaningful kind of feedback loops in these kind, or feedback cycles in these kind of contexts, would require quantification. For regulators, they really wanted a greater contextualization of the AOP, extending to the stressor, and so extending to, before MIE to the stressor, and that the adverse outcomes should also be extended beyond an adverse outcome towards the community and the ecosystem level. And there was a lot of discussion about this, because even if they felt that even if there is not specific data about that, they wanted to have that greater contextualization, or some way of pointing towards that, because those are the kinds of levels at which these regulators were making decisions. So it is a way of showing the relevance of the AOP to the kinds of decisions that they are making. There was a need for disambiguation of arrows. There's currently the dotted and solid arrows, the differences between them are not clear. Possibly this shows up a conceptual difficulty with what is an adjacent key event. It's something to look at, but generally people felt that they didn't really know what was the difference between those two types of arrows. And then also difference between static and dynamic for different purposes. Can we have a click, please? So the regulators, for example, said that they needed to have a static diagram to be able to refer to. This was the this is what it looks like at this particular period of time. This the kind of a time stamp on it. So this is so that a decision could be anchored to a particular state of the AOP. But also they wanted this dynamic aspect for a more kind of interactive play with it. I thought this quotation put it very well. They wanted to be able to have this dynamic element, to be able to interact with it, play with it, collapse, expand it, make comparisons, and look at the interactions between AOPs, because none of these AOPs exist on their own. For your own context of use, as regulators said, it's important to have a way to look at AOPs that's very tactile, and this tactile was a very important aspect of it. This idea that the more you can interact with it, the more sort of tactile it gets for you, and the closer you get to the evidence for each part of it that is relevant for you. But then the static aspect is really important. So if you can take an image of it and put it into a report, it's so saying that this is what was available at the time when this report was written. And that could I have another click, please? So they wanted to be able to see a time stamping on the AOP diagram, and also the approval level of the AOP readable directly from the diagram. There's also an ongoing conversation about how to present validation in or alongside the diagram. And this is linked to this approval level, this issue of the approval level. And there's a lot of discussion about that, because there was also then the transparency about what that validation actually meant to different kinds of users. And those were the top level points that came from our discussions. There are several others as well that will be reported more fully. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anna-Maria, about that. For that, next point in the agenda is how will we include the FAIR principles into the AOP-Wiki in the upcoming versions? Next click, please. You all know that data and knowledge should be fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Next click. I mean, I don't go into the details of these 14 principles that a database or knowledge base should keep in mind in order to be fair. And that is something that we try to build into the AOP-Wiki in the next versions. Next slide, please. So is the AOP-Wiki fair? There is an upcoming initiative in which we will, for each of the FAIR principles that you saw on the previous slide, define what they call, or what we call, a fair enabling resource, an FER, meaning we will analyze the situation. How fair are we concerning these 14 principles? And how do we implement these 14 principles? And these are then our fair enabling resources. And these FERs together are then our fair implementation profile, which will show us, okay, this is how fair we are. This is where there are still gaps. And this is where we need to become fairer. So a gap analysis will show where we have to become fairer. Next one, next slide, please, or next click, please. And this is not an afterthought. So fairness in a knowledge base or in a database is not just a feature that you add on, but it needs to be in the DNA of the knowledge base, and it must become a guiding principle for further development. And that's what we're trying by establishing this fair implementation profile. So for all of you who are asking themselves, how is the AOP-Wiki doing concerning this buzzword fair? That's what we try to achieve in the coming months and maybe even years. Thank you very much. Handing over to Jason. And I think that is already the last presentation of our presentation part, and then we go to the Q&A session. Jason, over to you.
All right, so related to this fairness idea and related to a lot of the things we've been talking about is trying to make this data in the AOP-Wiki a little more accessible and easier to manage. Next slide, please. AOPs have a lot of information, and anyone who's gone to the AOP pages, especially those that are fully developed and endorsed, they're very data rich, and navigating that information can be fairly daunting. The information that's collected is an attempt to establish the causal relationships along the AOP, and this is done by collecting specific kinds of evidence, the key event relationship pages, and also in the AOP pages. And the specific kinds of evidence are based on modified Bradford-Hill considerations. These include things like biological plausibility, essentiality, and various kinds of empirical evidence. And now I have an example over here on the right side of what this evidence documentation looks like. And as you can see, it's very heavily based on free text. And there's a few kind of problems associated with this. It's very time consuming for AOP developers, authors to collect their information and document information in this fashion. There's a lot of inconsistencies about how the information is documented across all the different AOPs. And this makes finding this information very difficult for anyone who wants to use it. It's not easily interpreted by computers in this fashion, and this makes it impossible to computationally search and aggregate and summarize this information. And so this is a bit of a challenge with kind of this dual presentation of information that we want for AOPs. We want all of the information about the evidence, and we want to know what papers and how confident we are in it, but we also want to summarize this in a very easy to understand way for potential end users. And so next slide, please. This has led the team behind the development of AOP-Wiki to start considering changes to how we collect evidence. And this has led to a data model project, pilot project. And this is also to accommodate other incentives like supporting systematic evidence collection strategies and improving the fairness of the AOP knowledge base. So next slide, please. So we have a pilot project going on right now that's investigating different approaches to data collection. We're focusing mainly on the key event relationship evidence, but eventually we want to expand to other kinds of evidence collected in the AOP-Wiki. And the overall goals of this project is to develop a new data model to collect the KER evidence in a standardized and machine-readable format, and develop a user-friendly interface with simplified data entry workflow. We started this project about a year ago, doing a smaller pilot project, just using the Microsoft Access platform. And with the lessons that we've learned from that pilot project, we've now brought it up onto an AOP-Wiki clone. And we now have this active on the emod.aopwiki.org website. And now we're currently testing this website. Next slide, please. And I can't go into too many details due to time, but I want to give you a quick overview of what this sort of looks like. In kind of inspired by systematic data collection approaches, we've decided to take a kind of what we're calling an evidence map workflow. This interface you can see in this table right here. There's a list of the papers and the list of the down in the rows on the left row column, sorry. And across the columns, there's different types of evidence. And if you could click, please, if you click on one of those boxes, instead of inputting your evidence in a narrative text format, we have developed some standardized forms that use fixed vocabularies for things like what type of experiment, is it in vitro, in vivo, what are the stressors being used, what are their CAS numbers, what are the species, and we use things like tax IDs and standardized vocabularies for life stages and sex, organs and cell terms and things like that. And if you can click again, please, that information gets distilled and summarized into this table where you can find out exactly what evidence is being collected and what papers and what the evidence are, and hopefully and then summarize that information in much more simple, brief descriptions in the bullets underneath. So the potential benefits of going this approach is that the information is now, instead of being free text, it's machine readable, and it adds a major increase to the overall fairness, how well we can interact with the data across different systems. The approach that we've developed is in support of systematic evidence collection approaches. We hope that this improves the transparency and all of the tracking of the information instead of just being in free text blocks. We hope that it also improves the consistency of how the evidence is documented across AOPs. And another benefit is that all of the individual contributions of each author are more compartmentalized. So you can easily see what individual AOP authors are doing. And it also makes it a little bit easier for crowd-based collaborations. Next slide, please. And so where we are right now, we're just, like I said, this is a small pilot project looking at KER evidence. And we're currently testing it out, and we want to get people's feedback. So we want to consult and test and consult and test. And we're hoping to build upon the experience that we're gaining here. We want to expand the data model to include different things like test methods, modulating factors. Essentiality is another important thing that we haven't addressed. We want to further ontologize this data so that it improves the interoperability with other databases. And an important thing is, how do we take all of this information and summarize it to target end users? So there's a lot of information being collected, and the end users aren't necessarily interested in all the minutia, but how do we deliver that in a really easy to interpret fashion? So these are the things that we're working on with developing this new data model and evidence collection method. And so we have a page on the AOP Wiki forum, and if we'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback if you have anything to share. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for, thank you to all the speakers for this presentation and great overview of the evolution of the AOP-Wiki. So we got quite a lot of questions and comments posted in the Q&A box. Some of them were already addressed during the presentations by the various panelists. There are still some that would need to be discussed and addressed. So yeah, I will have Clemens Whitwer and Dan Villeneuve. They will be the moderator of this session on Q&A. You can, of course, continue posting comments and questions, especially focusing on the future of the AOP-Wiki and the AOP framework, and on how to increase uptakes of AOPs in regulatory environments.
Thank you, Natalie. So we have 6 open questions and 17 already answered. So if you go to the Q&A box, you will find 17 questions already answered. And Dan and I will now have the privilege to pick some of the questions that are still unanswered and try to answer them online here. I mean, online, say, live, talking about them. Jason, I just wanted to pick that one. Jason, Julia asked, could one join the testing? But Jason is already typing the answer, I see. So
I'll just answer that right now real quickly.
Yeah,
absolutely.
please,
we are very, very much interested and welcome anybody's help in testing. You can send me an email, or you can even post your desire to help in the forum. But both will end up in my inbox, and I'll reach out to you. So yeah, would very, very much welcome your help.
Okay, Dan, do you have any favorite question that you want to read out aloud and then also answer?
Sure. So there was one of the early questions asked, said, this is a recent trend to consider AOPs as a predictive tool to infer individual adverse outcomes and more from data on molecular initiating events or key events. Writes, this somehow deviates from what the AOP concept is meant for, i.e. a framework to organize mechanistic information as it is generated from relevant, reliable studies. For consistent use of the AOPs, would it be worth considering some sort of disclaimer on what AOPs can do and can't do? And I guess just to answer this question, it's not necessarily assumed that the only role for AOPs is as a framework to organize mechanistic information. There is certainly an intent for AOPs to support their use as a predictive tool when the quantitative understanding of the pathway supports that. And in general, we don't include some disclaimer on what AOPs can or can't do because it's very context dependent. They're fit for purpose for different applications depending on the level of evidence and detail that's provided in the description, and what's a suitable application for one AOP may not be suitable for the next. And so we don't have a general disclaimer. We don't try to impose limitations on the use or application of those AOPs. That's really a decision for the user. And what we're trying to provide is documentation of those AOPs in a way that allows the users to assess for themselves the appropriate fit for purpose.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I see an intriguing question from Wiki Stone here, submitted at 2:05 p.m. Does the OECD have a set of symbols that they already use for different applications? For another working group, we were also thinking of using symbols as a way to indicate relevant information. It could be good to coordinate this. I think this also refers to the visualization discussion. So I think that goes down the road of trying to come up with a standardized, as Vicky wrote, symbols that mean the same things in the OECD context. Maybe someone from OECD can talk about that. Do you have visualization as aspirations, standardization aspirations also in other groups? I think it would really be great if we could agree on this symbol means this once and for all in the OECD context.
Yes, definitely. I think it would be good, but I'm not aware of this attempt. Maybe Hannah can bring her ideas. I will talk with my colleagues from the Working Party on Manufactured Nanomaterials, and then maybe we will start from there.
Yeah, that sounds really like a good idea. Thank you, Vicky. Dan, you have another candidate? I think we are 5 minutes from. We still have 6 minutes left. Natalie, please tell us when we have to stop.
Yeah, maybe we have still 3 minutes to continue, and then I will conclude. I won't need more than 3 minutes.
Okay. Dan,
okay, so there's a question from Penny Niemark, and I'll just mention that Penny had some other good suggestions for the wiki that was typed into the Q&A, such as using the DOIs to better help tag the references, associating ORC IDs with the various contributors, for example. Those were great suggestions, and we would encourage anyone with suggestions like that to definitely document those in the AOP forum. That's a great way to get your suggestions out there, put them on a list, and they're present, easy for us to access when we go back to think about the new features. And it's a great place to start a discussion around those features. So we really encourage that. But Penny also has a question saying, I see a lot of benefit of annotation of key events with key event components, ontologies such as gene ontology in bioinformatics approaches. Are there any updates in terms of the key event components planned? For example, improved use of the annotation function among AOP developers. Somebody want to take that? Maybe Steve or Clemens or Jason?
I can take it. It disappeared.
Yeah,
as you were speaking, let me see if I can find it.
I guess it really related to updates to the key event components and encouraging authors to make better use of those key event components.
Yeah, so a lot of the redesign that Jason talked about is intended to kind of move from a text first, free text first implementation to a more structured entry for the basic information on the front end. And so that would leverage heavily. I mean, we already use gene ontology and others, but the idea would be, whereas now the event components are more of an afterthought. It's after you've put everything in, then we're asking you to put yet more information in. We'd like to kind of turn that around and have the structured information go in first, and then possibly some free text summaries at the end after you've collected all of your data. And that also gets back to the more structured capturing of the references that links back to the earlier question that you mentioned, Dan. And so having more explicit links to the original references from which the data came, having more structured capturing of the information as it goes in, and then at the end, potentially having a free text summary of all the evidence that had been collected. And just, I know Jason was typing an answer. I'm not sure if he finished, but since it relates to this, Richard Curry had a question on being able to submit from other databases, being able to submit in bulk. And I would hope that some of these changes would also help facilitate that process as well, because part of the reason we haven't been able to allow it to date is because of the free text nature, and everybody kind of co-editing things and being able to keep track of. If you're allowing people to send a lot of data at one time, it's just really impossible to make sure that everything is interleaved correctly.
Yeah, I'll just in response to that question, I was typing up. They were asking, can we import data from other databases into this new data model? And in principle, it's possible. In fact, part of the pilot project was to import information from the US EPA's ecotox database into this data model. And while it worked, it's very, very manual at the moment. You really have to manually align all of the different entries. And so future work to ontologize both the ecotox database and other databases, as well as the AOP database, need to be done before we can truly automate it. And so then it could be automated. And in the meantime, it can be done manually, but it's a little more, takes more time to do.
Thank you. I think we should stop now. There are still a few questions that have not been addressed, if I'm correct.
I think the last one from Natasha Petrovic is a nice way of ending this webinar, because she asks about targeted workshops for specific working groups when it comes to using AOPs for regulatory purposes, and who initiates these workshops. So I think that can be the OECD, isn't that?
Yes, of course. And yeah, more and more we are introducing AOPs to the various different projects that we have, and it could be, we could definitely organize workshops in the various areas of our program. So with this, I think it's time to conclude. Thank you for the questions, and so that's our last slide. It's now time for all the participants to navigate on the insightful waters of the AOP-Wiki, and to consider how you would like to get more involved. Your participation is key, as you heard several times. Your ideas are very welcome. They will help us shape the AOP framework of the future. The AOP development program at the OECD is transitioning with a stronger focus on regulatory needs A new advisory group on emerging science in chemical assessment will be established early 2023. This advisory group will provide advice to the OECD working parties, the higher committees, and will be overseen by the Working Party of the National Coordinators for the Test Guidelines Programme and by the Working Party on Hazard Assessment. And in this context, the Society for the Advancement of AOPs, the SAAOP, which was created at the start of the AOP framework development, will have an increased role bringing together and working with the AOP community of practice. So if you wish to get involved, you can thus do it via different ways. You can join the AOP community of practice and contact the SAAOP with the email address that is on the screen, or you can ask to the OECD Secretariat the coordinates of your respective working party head of delegation. And when the new advisory group is established early 2023, we can then put you in contact with your national contact point in this group. And you can also use the AOP forum in the wiki to share your ideas on AOP development, AOP use, and the AOP knowledge base. You can either contribute to the existing thread or you can start your own discussion thread. So we are looking forward to always broadening the AOP community and providing tools that are tailored to the needs of the users. So please share your ideas and views for them to be taken into account in future developments. So in the future, workshops will be organized to refine the development of the roadmap for the AOP-Wiki beyond the version 2.6, using various sources of inputs, including yours. So stay tuned for the future evolution of the AOP knowledge base and don't hesitate to contribute to this evolution. And with this, I would like to thank you all for joining. Thank you for your interest in this topic. As we mentioned, we will address the remaining question by written, but we will check, maybe there's no more. So have a nice day, everyone, a nice afternoon or evening. Goodbye and thank you again.